In the preface of the Mass for the Dead, we find these words: "For your faithful, O Lord, life is changed, not taken away." In our world, the physical life is, according to the way we believe, the greatest thing. And therefore, physical death is seen as the greatest evil. And we even resist the process by which a person normally dies. We resist aging. We resist death. We even resist the appearance of aging. And we try to make death seem somehow as clean and comfortable as we possibly can. I remember once seeing an ad when I was stationed in Arkansas. On the side of a truck, it was a casket company, and it said, "Comfortable caskets." And the more you think about that, the stranger it is. We no longer have the idea that gray hair and wrinkles bring dignity and a certain venerableness to you. People were respected because old people were thought to have accumulated wisdom and a certain gentleness and kindness through experience. Old people were thought to be good advisors, good friends, and good to have around. Now we have surgeries to disguise our aging. And that's why we have this sort of paranoia about smoking or drinking or anything else that harms the body, because we don't really believe there's anything else. That's really what drives it. It's a kind of atheism. We believe that when life's over, that's really it. And it's a relief to know through our faith that there's something quite different. Death means that life is changed, not taken away. The soul and the body are in a mysterious relationship, but the body receives its life not only from its own well-being, from being in good condition, but also from the soul. I remember how strange I thought it was when I was in college and we were discussing different souls, different kinds of souls. I thought, well, I didn't know there were different kinds of souls. So for a plant, there's what's called a vegetative soul. And when the plant's destroyed, the soul's destroyed. And for animals that are not human, there's an animative soul. And when the animal dies, the soul also ceases to exist. And then there's the human soul, which alone among those is supernatural and lives on. Which means that even though you did indeed have a beginning, in a certain sense, you're immortal. That means you don't die ever. You continue, and you continue, and you continue. And so your life on earth is just the first step in a journey that, in a certain sense, never ends, even though we arrive in heaven. And there's no change in heaven. If you want to read interesting theology, you have to look at what Thomas Aquinas has to say about what will be like in heaven. He acknowledges that our bodies will be perfect, and that they will not grow older. But then you have to start understanding how the people in the Middle Ages thought. They thought that the perfect age for a woman was 25 and the perfect age for a man was 35. It was very peculiar to our thinking. We usually think, of different ages for perfection without going into it. But they also realized that man's happiness would be eternal. All that a man could possibly long for when he's perfect would be God. All other desires being in perfect order and not troubling him in the least. Which brings us in a strange way to the topic of purgatory, because in purgatory you have a profound realization that God is your whole happiness, but you don't have God. You have the longing for God. And you have an awareness that you're not at all worthy to be in His presence. And you wouldn't want to be in the presence of God in that condition. And so you know you need to be in purgatory. But your greatest suffering is not any physical punishment. Your greatest suffering is not to be with God. Your greatest desire is not fulfilled. And if you could die from the pain of not having God, you would. But being a soul, you can't die. So you just linger. Which is why we pray for the dead. It is a most unfortunate thing that the Protestants got rid of some of the books of both the Old and New Testament. In Maccabees, we find the words, "It is a holy and a wholesome thought to pray for the dead that their sins may be loosed." The occasion was a battle in which many men had died, and one of the leaders of the men who had died had money offered up so that prayers would be said for the dead. Why? So that their sins would be loosed. Even before the coming of Christ, there was that concept among some of the Jewish people that there was indeed a next life and that people would indeed linger because of the weight of their sins, unable to enter into that blessed place we now call heaven. If you read the writings of St. John of the Cross, some of you have gotten into that. It's not necessarily for everyone, but St. John of the Cross talks about two different stages in the spiritual life. And I bring them up only because it makes a very urgent point that has to do with this particular liturgical celebration. St. John of the Cross talks about how there are two times when a soul that advances all the way to perfection and sanctity, complete sanctity in this life, goes through. Two stages. Dark night of the senses, in which the person has given up the things of the world and God helps him to pass through a period where he has no desire for anything of the world, but he simply is desirous of God. So he becomes a good servant of God. And very often, while going through that stage which God brings upon it, the person's prayer grows much better. And often they also go through terrible privations and sufferings. Loss of friends, suffering from gossip, maybe people that they love very deeply die. All kinds of things go wrong. They come out of that stage, normally after some years, and they're much holier, and they grow in holiness, and they grow and they grow. But according to John of the Cross, they're just getting started. He said it's like a garden full of weeds, and you chop the tops off of all those weeds, and things can grow in the garden now. But the problem is that the soil is filled with the roots of all these weeds, and they cause a great deal of harm, and they always threaten to grow back. And a good gardener knows he has to go in there with the hoe and the plow, and has to tear the soil up completely and rip all those roots out. And that's called the dark night of the Spirit. And when you read the lives of the saints, they go through what is truly frightening just to read about. It's very painful. It's like being dead and being alive at the same time somehow. Complete darkness. And they often feel not only that God has abandoned them, but sometimes it feels that God hates them. It's a terrible, terrible darkness, which purifies them. And it does that equivalent of ripping out all the roots of all those weeds in their souls. And when they finally come out of that, they're ready for the final stages of holiness. Now, St. John goes on and on and on about all this. And then he says very casually, and if you go through all of this in this life, then you don't have to go to purgatory. What does that mean for the rest of us? That means that's where we're headed. And I can recall safely because it happened 20 years ago or so, my grandmother's funeral, which was completely packed, big family, and the priest got up and said, I'm sure that God sees all the prayers you have already prayed and are praying now and will pray in the future, and so we can be sure that Catherine is in heaven. And I thought to myself, that doesn't seem like what I was taught. And that's what we always do now. We're so sure. And we say it's God's mercy and it's God's love, and we've prayed, and she was such a good lady, or he was such a good man, and that's it. We've forgotten our theology. We've forgotten the perfection of God. We've forgotten that the soul is a very complex thing, made for great holiness and total purity. And it's only when you've gone through all that you must go through to arrive at that total purity that you can be even capable of stepping into the presence of God. Because you couldn't stand to be in front of Him otherwise. We need to remember our theology. That is why we're here. That is why we have all those names of all your deceased that you've written down, and we've placed them up near the tabernacle to be remembered for the next month. That's why we have funeral masses. That's why we have all over in our liturgy prayers for the deceased all the time. As it says in Maccabees, it's a holy and a wholesome thought to pray for the dead that their sins may be loosed.